Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another video with On Point Politics, your number one stop for all things polling and election analysis in the United States. Today, we're going to be collaborating with Gold Crown Politics to talk about the 2024 presidential election. We're going to be talking about our polling averages, our election models, and criticizing Nate Silver as well as 538's model to basically differentiate ourselves and try to be the most accurate forecasters for this presidential election. Hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you want more content just like this. Gold Crown, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Pump Politics. Thanks for having me on. Let's get it started.
All right, guys. So essentially, right now, looking at my model, I mean, Donald Trump essentially has a 73% chance to win the Electoral College. Now, what's pretty fascinating is we're gonna have a new model now that's coming out pretty soon, which is good. It's basically going to be computer programmed instead of programmed through the Google Sheets, and we'll be able to run 100,000 simulations instead of just 1,000. So we'll kind of have a wide variety of results coming up pretty soon based out of what we're looking at. And Harris is just at about 26 percentage point odds looking at the election here. And we're also going to be looking at Nate Silver's popular vote slash, electoral college bias thing to kind of show technically what his chances would be based on what we have. But Donald Trump is very well comfortably winning in my model in the swing states fairly easily. And looking at my model explained, when we look at the 2020 model, it's basically dead even. I mean, it's almost perfect. I mean, the margins are a little bit iffy here and there, off by a point or so in some, maybe two at most. But usually, when they're off by two, it tends to be a state being overestimated for Joe Biden. So, in reality, this is the best model you could have found for the election out there out of any model, including The Economist, including 538. So, looking at this now, we see that in 2020, this was the actual result, and this was my 2020 model. And Gold Crown Politics also has a model that would have essentially predicted the 2020 election with 100% accuracy going into it. And we do have his margins, pulled up here in his modeling pulled up. And I want you to go ahead and break this down for us.
Yeah, so I currently have a couple of models that do help me predict the national vote. You can see there at the top, this is my polling bias model. I basically take an average of all the polls in the 2024 election cycle. I take an adjusted average, and then I apply the 2020 polling bias that happened in that cycle. And if you scroll down, you can see my next model. This one here is my job approval model. I basically calculate Kamala Harris's job approval as vice president. And I basically, job approval, it's a very good tracker of vote share. Historically, it's been one of the best trackers of vote share. And so basically, what I do, if you scroll down a little bit there, you can see I weigh her job approval to a D+1 electorate, which, to be honest, is, I think that it's probably going to be a tied electorate. So if anything, I'm actually giving her the benefit of the doubt. But even with a D+1 electorate, her job approval is at about 47% if you adjust for undecideds. And so she's basically getting 47% nationally. As you see there, I have third parties getting just under 3%, and Trump is getting over 50% nationally, which is very good for him. It would be his best performance nationally, better than 2016 and 2020. And so he's up by over 3 points in that model. And then you can scroll down and see my favorability model. Trump leads this one by 2 points. Trump, historically speaking, he outperforms his favorability by about 5 points. Kamala Harris, she typically, she actually will very likely underperform her favorability. Many people bring that up as a thing, saying, oh, well, she's going to outperform Trump nationally because her favorability is higher than his. But no, and Joe Biden, he actually underperformed his adjusted favorability if you adjust for undecideds. And so I think that Kamala Harris will as well. This is what my model is indicating. And you can scroll down a bit further to see my model average. I basically model out those three margins to get an average of Trump plus 2.7. That's his lead nationally. As of right now, he's getting 50% of the vote share compared to Kamala Harris with about 47%. And so he has a strong national lead right now. And if you scroll down, you can see some of my state margins right there. I break it down You can look at the swing states. Trump is leading in all the swing states in my model right now. Republicans typically do really well in the swing states. They typically vote to the right of the country. So if Trump really has any lead nationally, he's looking really good by election day. And so these are the margins that I have for my model. I do understand that on point, you have pretty similar margins as well. Maybe you could go into your margins.
And so, yeah, I mean, at this point, we do have pretty similar ones at that. I mean, all the swing states practically, I mean, your Nevada margin, for whatever reason, is a lot higher. It's probably because my adjusted polling average is like only a 2 point lead for Donald Trump, which I find kind of suspicious. But our margins are pretty similar. I mean, I have about a 6 point win in Wisconsin, a 6 point win in Pennsylvania, 6 point win in Georgia, 6 point win in Arizona. It's probably actually a little bit more than 6 points in Arizona, probably 6.5. North Carolina is about 7.5 points. Minnesota, I believe you have it 2 points bluer than me. Your New Hampshire one's about a point bluer than mine, probably even a little bit less than that. Actually, it's probably half a point bluer. New Mexico, I think we're kind of around the same thing. Same thing in Virginia. I think yours is a point bluer. Your main one kind of matches up with mine. So we are at pretty similar margins. Even my Colorado margin is like a 7 to 8 point victory for Kamala Harris. And currently, you have Colorado as about a 9 point win. So pretty close to that. Illinois, mine's actually about a 9 point win, and you have it basically at a 9 point win. My New York margin is interesting because mine is just a little bit over 10. I mean, it's a tiny bit over 10, and you also have it a little bit over 10 as well. So we're looking pretty similar. The only one that I'd say is vastly different is probably New Jersey. Even our Nebraska second model is pretty similar. But even looking at New Jersey, this is the only one that I'm like, okay, well, I'm not really sure about that one exactly, give or take, just because of the fact that, there may be some discrepancy there. I believe that my model isn't tracking for New Jersey to trend as hard to the right as yours is. But I mean, I do have it as around a 6 point win, and you have it as 4.7. So it's not like we're completely off differences, like it's not like we're completely different. So far, I mean, we're looking pretty lined up. And guys, just so you can see this kind of lines up with my thinking too. But Harris would practically have to be ahead in the popular vote by at least 3.5 to even have a shot at winning the Electoral College. This puts her ahead in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania as the tipping point state. And you look at some of these margins here, and she would literally have to be outperforming the national popular vote that is currently Gold Crown's model by a little bit over 5 points in order to basically narrowly eke out a victory that wouldn't even be guaranteed at that point. We probably both have to call it a toss up race at that point because we wouldn't really have a definitive winner. And that would just be a horrible look for the Kamala Harris campaign. I mean, that would just be really, really bad. And now it's like she literally has to outperform our current estimated popular vote of anywhere from 2.7 up till 3.4, like I have it in my average. But we see that Donald Trump does maintain a pretty strong lead in Gold Crown's model. Now he is basically projecting their vote shares at this point in time. What I'm doing is I'm just kind of aggregating all the polls together and essentially just averaging them out. Now, I have two different versions of my aggregate. One version is where I include all of the possible pollsters that I can, including SoCal Strategies. And when we go ahead and factor that out, essentially Donald Trump is up in the model by roughly 3.4% in the popular vote, which is very close to the Atlas Intel poll that just came out of a plus 3.6. And even if we actually look at Gold Crown's modeling, his vote share model is actually really close to that as well. When you factor in Harris's adjusted job approval weight at D+1, it is very, very similar to that. I mean, it's super duper similar to what he had. And he's above 50. And in the poll, they had Trump at 50.9 and they had Harris at about 47.3%. So this is the closest thing that we have to the Atlas Intel poll right now. And the average is only about 0.9% off from that model. And mine is pretty close to that. And Atlas Intel was the most accurate pollster nationally in 2020 and internationally across different countries. And so when looking at this electoral map, it's going to be kind of hard for the former president to really even lose this electoral college matchup, guys. It's going to be incredibly difficult for him to lose this matchup. I mean, Iowa and Ohio in our forecast basically round off to over 15-point victories. Texas and Florida are sort of likely. California is just in the safe column. Hawaii currently in my forecast is like 18 points. DC, Maryland, Massachusetts, Vermont are currently in the safe column right now. But that's effectively it for the safe states, with Maine second going. That's about it. And I mean, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Illinois, Connecticut, Delaware, Rhode Island are in the likely column. If you were to average out both of our margins in New Jersey, it would probably be slightly above 5 points. Maine's first would probably be a likely margin alongside New York as well, including Texas and Florida, as well as North Carolina. And so we have a few swing states left. And you know what? I'll probably have Gold Crown just kind of go through the battleground states, and we'll kind of talk about them as we go.
So we'll start first with the state of Nevada with its 6 electoral votes. In my model, I currently have the state at about a 7 point victory. I understand on point that you have a similar margin of around 6 points, so a pretty similar margin. This is going to be a likely Republican state this cycle, at least as of right now. Donald Trump, he is going to see a lot of improvement with especially working class Hispanic voters in the state. The state is not very college educated, and it's historically been trending to the right for the past few election cycles. So I'm very confident that the state will continue its rightward trend this election cycle and be about a 6 to 7 point win as it looks right now. We can also look at the state of Arizona, a border state. I see this as about a 7 point race for Trump as of right now. On point, I forget what you said your exact margin was, but I think it's fairly similar, you said. And I definitely think that, this state, in terms of the trend, it is a little difficult to track just because there's kind of conflicting information. Historically, Arizona has been trending to the left for the past handful of cycles, really ever since Trump entered politics in 2016. It's been trending to the left, but the current demographics of the state would indicate that it could trend slightly to the right. Just because of the fact that Arizona is a border state, and of the 7 swing states, Arizona is the only state where immigration actually rivals economy in terms of the top issues. And so we have that one as a likely Republican state for Donald Trump. We can also look at the state of Georgia. Let's go to that one next. I have that one in my model at about a 6.5 point victory right now for Donald Trump. It's in the likely column. In terms of the trend, I think it's going to be a pretty neutral trend. It's hard to, approximate exactly, but I do think that Trump will see pretty big gains with African Americans in the state. It's about a 30% African American electorate. And Trump is doing really well with black men if you look at the crosstabs. And so, despite the fact that the state is more college educated, and despite the fact that the state has been trending to the left for the past few cycles, I do think that the trend will be, somewhat neutralized because of Trump's improvement with black voters. We can also look at the state of New Mexico. This one, in my current projection, is about a 2 to 3 point win as of right now for Kamala Harris, and that would be a lean margin. And on point, what is your margin for the state of New Mexico, by the way?
My margin there is probably around what you have it at. I mean, mine is basically at about a 2.7 percentage point margin. It's literally right there, basically spot on to what you have. So basically lining up perfectly. Both of our projections pretty much are.
Wow, yeah, yeah. And I have the state trending about a point to the right this election cycle, just because Trump is improving with Hispanic voters. And the fact, coupled with the fact that the state is a border state as well, immigration will play a larger role here than in the non border states. But yeah, I think about a 2 to 3 point win seems really good. And the fact that we both have very similar margins gives me a lot of confidence in the state. We can also look up north to Minnesota. I have this state at about a 2.5 point victory for Kamala Harris right now. It's in the lean column for Harris. I understand on point that you have a fairly similar margin, or it's a little closer for Trump in
I
your
currently
margin.
I currently have it as like a 0.2 percentage point win for Harris. It's way closer to my average. So that's about
Oh,
right right now.
gotcha. Gotcha. But yeah, I definitely think that, for Minnesota, it will most likely continue its historical leftward trend. The state is more college educated. I do think that Tim Walz will likely help Harris. He'll boost her in the state by about a point or so, give or take. But I will say that the state historically has been pretty elastic in terms of its voting trends. And so on point having the state closer is very, very possible because the state does typically vote pretty elastically. It's pretty similar to New Hampshire in that regard. And we can also look at New Hampshire. Speaking of, I currently have that state as a 1 point margin for Kamala Harris right now in the lean column on point. I understand that you have a pretty similar margin in the state. Maybe it's a little closer. I definitely see, this state. Like I said with Minnesota, it's a very elastic state. There are a lot of independents that swing heavily to Democrats and Republicans alike, cycle by cycle. It makes the state a little unpredictable to predict. But if you do things like what On Point Politics is doing, if you weigh the polls based upon the party electorate, you can get a pretty accurate result. And he has a closer margin than I do. And I'm probably going to do state margin averages as well and weigh by party. And so the state could be very competitive for Donald Trump. And then we can also look at the state of Virginia. I currently have this as a 4 point margin for Kamala Harris right now. On point, what is your margin for Virginia?
I currently have it as a 2 point race. Funny enough, the most accurate pollster that had a Biden plus 10 poll in 2020 as their final poll, and that had Youngkin winning in their last poll in 2021, actually has a Harris plus 2 matchup in a head to head. And with the full ballot without RFK, she's actually only ahead by one.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I definitely think that the state is definitely more competitive than most people realize. I definitely think at the very least it's in the lean column for Harris, potentially in the tilt column, depending on the way that you look at it. But I definitely think that it's pretty competitive. I have it at about 4 points. Of course, there was a semi recent Roanoke poll that had, I believe, Harris plus 3 in the state. And so it definitely is more competitive than people realize. And then we have the final three Rust Belt states up there. Let's start with Wisconsin. I currently have this state at about a 5.5 point margin for Trump. And what is your margin for Wisconsin?
My margin is about a little bit over 6 points. I think it's a 6.3 percentage point win for Donald Trump.
Pretty close, a pretty close margin. But yeah, it's about a 6 point race. Um, and so I think that, this state, it's going to trend a little bit to the left this cycle just because white voters as a whole are doing so. And Wisconsin is a pretty white heavy state. Now, I think that Trump's improvements with union voters as of recently, especially with Harris entering the race, she is doing horrible with union voters. Of course, there was the Teamsters member union survey that came out recently, and it showed that Trump is literally winning the Teamster members by like 20, 30 points in two different surveys. And that's compared to Biden, who actually was leading them by like 8 points back in July. So that's a huge shift. And the Rust Belt does have very pretty strong union ties as well. And so, could Wisconsin trend to the right? Potentially. It's been, trending to the right for the past couple of election cycles as well. And so it very well could trend to the right. And then we'll look at the state of Michigan next. I currently have this state as a 4 point a lean margin for Donald Trump with its 15 electoral votes. On point, what's your margin there?
That's literally exactly what I have. I think I have it as like plus 3.8.
Yeah, yeah, about a 4 point race in Wisconsin as of right now. This Rust Belt state, of course, Wisconsin is definitely the least favorable to Trump. If you look at the margins from back in 2020,
You need to
demographically as well, it also has a decent share of African American voters. Now, I do think that Trump he is improving with that voting bloc with black voters more than white voters, and so the state could potentially trend to the right. Um, Especially if you look at it in terms of union, how Trump is improving with union voters as well. But I definitely see the state at about a 4 point win right now. On point, you have it as a pretty similar margin. And then we can finish out the map with Pennsylvania. I have that as a 6 point win currently for Donald Trump. On point, what's your margin there?
That's basically literally what I have. Basically, like a 6 point race. That's literally what I have. I think I have it as like 6.2. something like that. I know Wisconsin and mine is redder, which I think is a good sign that I'm kind of onto something similar to you. I mean, you have Pennsylvania voting to the right of Wisconsin, like very slightly, but I have Wisconsin voting to the right of Pennsylvania, my thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, my kind of reasoning is I believe that Pennsylvania will vote to the right of Wisconsin, for the first time in quite a while, just because it's more ethnically diverse. You do have a decent amount of Hispanics in the state, and Trump is improving with Hispanics if you look at the crosstabs by the most of any voting bloc. And so and I also think that Joe Biden with his kind of Scranton Joe facade back in 2020, that kind of helped him in Pennsylvania. I honestly think that if Democrats, even if in the same national environment back in 2020, if they ran someone other than Joe Biden, the margin would have been a lot closer for Trump, just because, Joe Biden, he was able to kind of get those eastern Pennsylvania counties to shift to him. But now, with Harris, she has no appeal to, those white rural voters in Pennsylvania, especially to union members as well. She just doesn't have that same appeal that Joe Biden had. And so, these Rust Belt states could certainly trend to the right. I have them, trending pretty neutrally on point. Seems like you have that as well. But we can also look at the state of Maine up there, the state of Maine at large. I currently have this state at about a 3 point margin for Kamala Harris right now. It's in the lean column. I understand that you have a fairly similar margin in Maine. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically, I think I have it as like plus 2.6 Harris. So literally right about there.
Hmm. Yeah, and Maine is pretty similar to New Hampshire in the sense that the independents are a pretty large share of the electorate in Maine, and they're very elastic. They swing in kind of unpredictable ways sometimes, and so predicting the state is a little difficult. But I do think that it's regardless, it's going to be a lot more competitive than it was back in 2020 when it voted for Biden by about 9 points. Now it's about a 3 point race, give or take. And then we can finish out the map with Nebraska's second congressional district. I currently have this as just barely tipping for Trump. This election cycle, I currently have it as like under 0.1% for Trump. What's your margin for Nebraska second?
I believe I have it as like Trump plus 0.4. It's like basically the same. We have pretty similar margins pretty much everywhere, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and those similar margins, pretty much almost everywhere on the map, gives me a lot of confidence in my map as well. But yeah, for Nebraska second, I definitely think that Trump probably has just enough to flip the district. Of course, it was redistricted from last cycle, so it will get a little bit redder as well. It could potentially cancel out the leftward trend that happened. Or that could happen this cycle. But yeah, I definitely think that Trump has just enough to flip it, and you see that as well. And so that kind of finishes out the electoral map. As I said, we have very similar margins in a lot of these states. And we do we have different models. Like he does based upon the state polls, and he weighs by party, and based upon like the shares of a party, and he weighs them based upon the bias of every state. And I kind of do it a little bit differently. I kind of calculate the national environment based upon the model that I showed you guys in the beginning of the video. And then I don't even use technically an exact model to predict the trend. I basically just look at the demographic data by state. I look at college education, the racial demographics, and as well as the historical trends as well. And I basically estimate it kind of using intuition. And based upon our two separate models, we're getting very similar margins. And so that gives me a lot of confidence this election cycle. And it certainly is pointing to a Trump victory that's much larger than what the majority of the forecasters are predicting. 538, they have just horrific margins. I mean, their state margins were so off back in 2020. And you can see that they have Kamala Harris winning 60% of the time compared to Trump at 40%. I mean, that just doesn't really seem accurate to me, because Trump is up nationally based upon the best key indicators that we have. And if he's up nationally, there is no way that Kamala Harris is leading in terms of the odds of this race. I mean, there's just no way, because the swing states are going to vote to the right of the country. And on point, you can add on to that if you want to.
Well, yeah, look at this. I mean, talking about the chances of Trump winning, I mean, basically our margins, looking about right here, we have all of our models basically range from Trump plus 2 to 4. And that basically ranges from Trump plus 99.9 to 100% chance to win the Electoral College effectively. So that's where we're getting that number from. And that's where Gold Crown kind of gets his number based on Nate Silver's kind of Electoral College bias projection thing that he's kind of looking at. And he kind of has this graph here looking at some electoral vote distributions and whatnot, which is kind of interesting. But looking at the 538 model, I mean, this is already pretty bad. You're talking about Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada already favored to go to Harris. You're talking about a model that, for whatever reason, at the end of August, just completely shot up for Trump. And the second the debate happened, all of a sudden, it just so happened to be that Trump fell in the aggregate. It doesn't really make any sense. But when you look at the polls that are being used nationally, he has New York Times, he has Atlas Intel, but for whatever reason, yes, it does sort of have a high influence, but New York Times has a way higher influence than that poll even does in the aggregate. And so it's kind of weird that he currently has Harris up 2 points in the popular vote, because if he was really weighing by party, he would have an electorate or electoral college margin very similar to ours, but he has a Harris plus 2.3 margin, which is really, really interesting. And I think that's kind of strange to look at here. And when you look at some of his state margins, guys, I mean, some of these like Washington plus 17, New York plus 16, Illinois plus 15. So apparently Illinois is only going to shift to the left by or to the right by 0.3%. But Colorado shifts to the right more than Illinois does. Like, and then you have Maine basically actually shifting to the left from the last cycle, despite the popular vote in his model shifting 2 points to the right. New Mexico gets basically 3 points closer, Virginia 3 points closer, but New Hampshire's only a point closer. Minnesota's like 2 points closer, Nebraska not that much, but then Michigan gets closer, Pennsylvania gets closer, and Wisconsin, roughly give or take, are about the same margin. And Wisconsin is his tipping point state, which in my case would technically also be the case as well. But he's also got Nevada going blue, which is weird because those college educated voters are really not favoring Kamala Harris right now, or at least the sort of non-college educated are not favoring Harris right now. And so it wouldn't really make sense for that to be the case. And it's North Carolina margin. I mean, you're telling me North Carolina is going to be the same margin as last time when Trump is performing better in the North Carolina aggregate by like 5 to 6 points compared to last time. Arizona is only a Trump plus 2 margin with Georgia as well. Florida, Trump plus 4.6. Like, are you kidding me? Only a point better than last time. Like, guys, this is a flawed model. So apparently Texas is going to become a point more Republican, but Iowa's going to shift to the left. Like, come on, guys. This is kind of a really crappy model, in my opinion. And the fact that his model swung this heavily, this quickly, really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It sort of seems like he's kind of basically going off of certain events to, basically pretty much like follow a narrative, sort of like you see here when Harris chooses her VP. Oh, look, she goes up. DNC starts. Oh, she maintains. And then Kennedy drops out. It's like, oh, whoa, look, he gained all the independent support. And now the debate comes. Oh, look, Harris did good during the debate. Now all of a sudden Trump falls. Like, it's like he's just following all the mainstream talking points in the political media sphere. And when you look at like all these margins, I mean, he's just averaging out all his favorite pollsters and giving influence to the New York Times as the best poll and the Emerson College State polling as his best margin for some reason. Like, you're looking at Michigan, he's giving a D+5 Michigan poll the best influence in his aggregate. Like, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Quinnipiac is getting a 1.1% influence in the aggregate. Like, this just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But even though Inside Advantage was way closer, it gets a little bit less of an influence. Like, it really doesn't make any sense. Like, you're looking at this, right, guys? Like, look at this. He's got like Epic MRA, which was actually one of the more, it was not super accurate. It was more accurate in 2020 and 2016, has a 0.03% influence in his polling average. It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You even have polls from, like, for example, even like ones from August, Fabrizio Lee's 0% influence. Like, come on, guys. This is a little bit facetious, in my opinion, in terms of a polling average, because a lot of the more accurate pollsters, he's kind of weighing them down a bit. In pollsters that tend to be more inaccurate, it's looking a lot better. And like even now, it's like the national polling average, like how did like for example, Trump was at about 39%, Biden at like 38. They were tied while Kennedy was at 15. I mean, Kennedy wasn't even gonna get 15% in July. That was already old news. So it didn't really make a whole lot of sense that that was the case either. And the 538 margins, I mean, Gold Crown, really? Harris 510 electoral college votes as a scenario. I think the best scenario we have for her is like a 350 scenario. And that's like pushing it, right? And Trump's best case is like in the early 400s, but they have ones in like 460s, 490s, even one at 500. But like Harris is not even going to touch the 390s, the 380s, even anything past 400 is just complete fantasy land, because that would essentially assume that either Iowa or Ohio are flipping at that point, and they are not going to her under any circumstances whatsoever. Even 330 for Harris, 351, that's already very bullish. And believe it or not, 349 is actually Alan Lichtman's son's electoral college prediction, with North Carolina and Florida both going blue. That's kind of hilarious. And so when you look at this now, clearly Donald Trump is favored to win. You have a lot of models that are really not making a whole lot of sense. Funny enough, they're actually including SoCal Strategies in the aggregate, which is very interesting. But I feel like they're only including it because SoCal Strategies has Harris up in his poll. I feel like that's the only reason why they're even considering to include Harris in the average. And SoCal is the pollster that we sponsor. You guys should go in the description down below to the GoFundMe to donate, because we do want to conduct some state polls and national polling before the election ends, so he can have a poll to basically have a track record for when the results come out. We can see how accurate he's going to be come the next election cycle. But overall, these models that are flawed are showing Harris either winning narrowly, like Gold Crown has when it's a 3.5 point race for Harris nationally, or 538 just being completely out the window, and Florida being a 69% chance to go to Trump, but for whatever reason, Wisconsin 62% chance to go to Harris. So you're telling me that Wisconsin going to Harris and Florida going to Trump nearly have the same amount of odds? I honestly think that's a little bit ridiculous. And just to look at this, guys, this is how easy it is for Trump to win. If Trump just improves 2 points with non-college educated voters, he's already winning the electoral college with Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. He's already winning it. And that's not even accounting for other groups. Let's say he improves a couple points with non-college, right? Let's say he improves a few points with them, and he's already up in Wisconsin by 3, in Pennsylvania by 2, North Carolina by 3. And if he's doing, slightly better with college grads, like let's say he's doing a couple points better, that'll give him a little bit of a boost in some states. But with African Americans, I mean, he is doing like he's probably going to get in the low 20s with them, to be honest. Let's say he gets 21%. That already puts Minnesota on the map for him. At that point, that would just be kind of basically expanding the map. And then New Mexico and New Hampshire flipping, coming from Hispanics, and then that Asian vote. I mean, if you were to make the Asian vote even a little bit closer, Virginia would effectively be a toss up state. So it's not hard for Donald Trump to win this race. Any shift with non college graduates, and he's winning the election either very narrowly or very comfortably. And right now, we currently have a modest win for him in the Electoral College. And so, if you guys did enjoy this analysis, make sure to hit the like button and to subscribe if you guys want more content just like this. And we will see you guys in the next video. Gold Crown, any last comments?
Thanks for having me on point. It was a good video. I have a lot of confidence in our margin for Donald Trump. It's looking very good for him. And thanks for watching this video, guys.